Welcome. Good morning. We are so excited and grateful to have you here for the Utah Shakespeare Festival Virtual Seminar Grove. Have a couple thank yous that we need to make sure that we're clear of. First of all, we're very grateful to the Cedar City Bryan Head Tourism Bureau who make this possible. And this week, Brian, you mentioned it before we started, this is high tide week here at the festival.
That's true, yes.
We would have had thousands of guests here. That's what time it is here. And we also would have had Camp Shakespeare. And so we want to thank those of you that participated last year in Camp Shakespeare and are presently watching in Camp Shakespeare. We're actually going to be talking about a little bit Michael Flockman, who was the founder of Camp Shakespeare and was actually the first official dramaturg of the Utah Shakespeare Festival. There were other dramaturgs or people who did that function prior to him. We can talk about Michael Finlayson and others, but we are thrilled that you are here as well. So, Brian, what are we talking about today?
Yes, hi, thanks, Michael. And yes, it is indeed, it would have been high time here at the festival this week, the last week of July and the first week of August are traditionally what we call our peak weeks here at the festival, where we have, thousands of patrons coming through, seeing multiple plays. And that's not happening right now. And it's very sad and very depressing. But it's great that we're here, connected, and being able to be here with you and provide you some elements of programming and some insight into what we do here at the Utah Shakespeare Festival. And two of our guests today are really key ingredients to putting these plays up here at the festival. And as Michael said, we're going to dive into the world of dramaturgy and what that means. And I'm really excited to have our two panelists today, Isabel Smith-Bernstein, who is currently pursuing her doctorate at the University of Colorado in Boulder and has been with us at the festival for multiple seasons as a dramaturg on many productions. And Lezlie Cross, who is on faculty currently at the University of Portland and has also been a key dramaturg here at the festival for many seasons. So I'd like to say welcome. Thank you both for being here today. We'll get some insight into what we do. And first and foremost, why don't we just kind of go around, why don't you give a little bit of feedback on who you are and some of your individual backgrounds would be great. Isabel?
Sure, I'm very happy to be here. My name is Isabel Smith-Bernstein. I've been a dramaturg at USF for the last 5 seasons, and last summer I was also a seminar director. So if I look familiar to anybody watching, that's why, but I don't have a microphone today. I've been a dramaturg for about a decade. I've specialized in classical dramaturgy. So really Shakespeare is kind of my entire life. I've worked, of course, at USF a lot, but I've also worked at OSF, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. The most recent show I worked on was actually Midsummer Night's Dream with Joe Hodge at OSF. And I'm currently, as Brian said, I'm pursuing a PhD in theater history, but it's focused on Shakespeare.
Great. Lezlie?
Hi, I'm Lezlie Cross, and I've been a dramaturg for a long time now. I haven't done the actual mathematical count, 15 years. And I started as a dramaturg at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. I worked in the literary office there for 5 years, and with Louis Douthit, who in my mind is the best in the biz. From there, I did a PhD at the University of Washington, and I have dramaturged not only at USF and OSF, but at other theaters across the country like Classic Stage Company, Actors Theater of Louisville, Cincinnati Shakespeare, where else? And numerous other places. So, I'm delighted to be here today to tell you all what we do, our mysterious job.
Well, one of the things I love is, both of you cross over in many various disciplines, also both in your positions at the universities where you're both located currently, teaching playwriting and as well as theater history and all these kinds of different avenues of intersection with theater. But primarily, we utilize you both as dramaturgs at our festival. And all of those, I think, kind of merge into this topic of dramaturgy, really, in many ways. And so the first question I have is, what is dramaturgy? I do think a lot of people and a lot of our patrons might not know exactly what that means and what that entails. So that's my first question. Have at it, whoever wants to answer the big nugget there.
Well, I think Isabel and I have talked about this more than once, because it is the question everybody asks you. I mean, your grandmother asks you, somebody in an elevator asks you, and one of the things that's challenging about it is that there's a lot of different answers. And so oftentimes when people ask me that, I say, well, it depends on the project, what dramaturgy is, because new play dramaturgy is a different kettle of fish than Shakespeare dramaturgy, which is what Isabel and I sort of specialize in. So with that preamble, Isabel, do you want to give your, I like your definition.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like it changes all the time. I don't know what I said the other day.
Know.
Yeah, dramaturgy, the job, of course, like as Lezlie says, it changes depending on the process and depending on who your director is in the project. And the role of the dramaturg is really a facilitator of communication between a whole bunch of different points. So it would be kind of a big web if I drew it, but it's things like the playwright and the company, even if the playwright is dead. So we're there to kind of represent Shakespeare in that situation, or the director and the actors, if there's some kind of communication problem, or the past and the present is a really important one. The audience and the play is another one, because part of our job is to kind of look as the audience in the room and to be as objective as possible.
And I would also say that a lot of dramaturgy is about providing context.
Mm-hmm.
So that's both context in terms of the historical context, the sociological, political context, but also institutional context. So the way we might approach a play at the Utah Shakespeare Festival is different than we might approach the play at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival or at the Folger where Isabel's worked before. Like there will be a different attack to the play based on the institution that you're working in. So bringing in that institutional knowledge is also a part of it. And being, I think the first audience is often the way that the dramaturg is described. Historically, the dramaturg's been thought of as the house theater critic. But I personally don't like that one because it sounds like we're going to judge everybody before it happens, and really we're there to help facilitate the work that is happening and to help bring the vision of the directors and the passion of the actors forward.
I mean, I love that. I mean, you know, obviously these plays are so complex and there's so many elements to them, and especially when you're looking at classical text, you know, these plays were written centuries before, and when they were written, the context was very different socially, economically, you know, globally, whatever that means. So having, you know, a dramaturg in the room to sort of also provide some of that information, research, but a lot of it is also like how that relates to now, you know, it seems in many ways. And how you can mine some of that stuff that might be worth mining, and then other things that you can kind of discard and go, well, we got to chalk that up as that's just something that might have been at the time period and is just really not as relevant as what it is now. Can you define your individual process on each of you? Let's say I'm working on Shakespeare. Let's make it Shakespeare specifically, because I do think, you know, there might be a different format when you're working with a new play or a more contemporary play that's already established. When you're looking at Shakespeare, I mean, usually what is your first, what are the first steps you take in diving into providing the research?
Well, I'll always read the play first, the text. Everything's rooted in the text, especially in Shakespeare, because there are so many kind of clues to find in there about what a line means, or what a moment could mean, or what it could have meant for Shakespeare, and how that translates now. So I'll always start in the text, and then actually I always read what Marjorie Garber, who's an excellent scholar, has written in Shakespeare After All, which is a book I'd recommend as well, because she writes in Shakespeare After All. She has an article on or a chapter on every single one of Shakespeare's plays, and she provides just enough context and just enough analysis to really kind of allow me as the dramaturg to kind of see which avenues are worth pursuing in research, because in a Shakespeare play, I could just research one forever. But at a certain point, you have to stop until the questions in the room start, at least. So that's kind of how I start every process. And then I talk to the director, of course. That's always a really big part of it. Because, you know, if the director wants to take Julius Caesar and set it in space, that's going to influence my work as a dramaturg, because I'll have to do research like, how do you move in space? You know, or, you know, if it's set in, or for instance, you know, on Hamlet last year, because it was set in Tsarist Russia, I did some research into kind of Russian politics and kind of that kind of feel, and so that we were kind of able to overlay that on the text of Hamlet.
That's great.
Yeah, I would say that given my knowledge of the plays at this point in my career, I actually start with the director because I've read all the plays, I've studied all the plays, I've, you know, worked on many of them. And so I am interested in where the director is starting from, because that will color my reading of the play this time around. And because one of the things I believe, and I do know that this is controversial, and I'm going to say it anyways, is that when we produce Shakespeare as 21st century Americans, and I would say the same thing has been happening for hundreds of years, that we are looking at doing an adaptation of Shakespeare when we produce Shakespeare. And so that adaptation is rooted in the director's vision. And so going back to what the director's vision is, helps me see the play through their eyes, and then I know how to help them get to where they want to go with the play. Because, you know, I've worked on 5 As You Like It at this point in time, and they have all been incredibly different. And the text has been different, the approach has been different, the setting has been different. And so for me, starting with the director and what the director wants to achieve helps me be able to see where I want to be looking, how I want to look at the play as well.
Yeah, and I mean, and some of them are obviously more complicated than others, you know, some of the, you know, quote unquote problem plays, as it were, that we sort of term as things that maybe, you know, they're just hurdles or, you know, a minefield of things that you can kind of go, oh, how does that measure up today? I don't know. Measure for Measure being one of them. You know, how you navigate those versus, like, per se, a history play, which is dealing with a lot of English history, names, locations, events, all these things that maybe a more modern American audience may not have any relation to, as well as a comedy, which is, you know, usually around love and circumstances and kind of mistaken identities or whatever. That's just maybe not as thorough and the steeped, I guess, in the historical quantity or of the play. How do those vary for you? I know, you know, Isabel worked on the Henry VI's that we did last season and the season prior, and, you know, those are plays that are just vast, for one thing, both in scope, but also there's so many people in them, you know. And I mean, where are some of those, what is some of the research you provided in helping the director or the cast sort of keep things in line?
I think in a history play, it's important always to emphasize that the history actually doesn't matter that much, because we are ultimately doing Shakespeare's adaptation of history. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, Hamilton now. I mean, Hamilton is a history play, and Hamilton leaves out a lot of things. It conflates things, makes up events, and that's exactly what Shakespeare was doing. So I do think that the most important thing research-wise in a history play is getting all the characters straight, because there's hundreds of them in the Henry VI's, and they're all related to each other. So I will share a chart that I made for the Henry VI's USF. So you'll see some familiar faces here. So this is the kind of chart that I made, and I made it on my iPad because it's much easier to be able to kind of draw this kind of thing. So I focused on, there are a lot of family trees of these families that exist, but none of them quite served our purposes. And because our adaptation of the Henry VI plays actually cut a lot of characters, which I think was, it was a small cast. So I left those people off of this chart, and it was easy for the actors to kind of find their face and then be able to kind of trace their lineage and who they're related to. And you can see everyone in the play, they're pretty much all cousins. And so this is the kind of thing that I find is quite helpful. It's a visual aid that doesn't bog you down in history too much, but it does kind of situate you in time as well. Because I included Henry VIII here in the House of Tudor, because of course that's Queen Elizabeth's father, and Queen Elizabeth is the monarch when Shakespeare starts writing.
Cool.
That's great. I mean, yeah, I mean, I know, having worked on some of those history plays, and yeah, they're complex, you know. I think I love what you said about, like, in some ways you have to think less about the historical elements that were happening and focus more on like what the potential elements might be, how in the now of it, and also how they relate to where we are currently, you know, because there's only so much an audience may digest at any given moment. And I've always found that with Shakespeare anyway. It usually takes them, you know, the first 10 minutes, 15 minutes to dial into the play, to, you know, to get the verse in their head, or the poetry sort of in the speaking, which is ironic because it's actually natural speech and the rhythm of the heartbeat of our lives, with the iambic pentameter, but also how they may only get so much, like 30% of the play that they'll really hear, but you'll follow where it is based on the given circumstances and what's happening. You know, one of the things I think is interesting about dramaturgy also is, like, have there been instances where you felt like the dramaturgy you provided helped sort of formulate another production, or what to be thinking about with the director? I mean, like, where you started at one point, the director was thinking one thing and there was some information that might have been provided by any one of you where you went, oh yeah, no, that's a great avenue, let's pursue that. Have any of you had that type of encounter?
Oh yeah, a lot of the time. I mean, I think it also depends on how early we're allowed into the process, because very often dramaturgs are brought in after the design process, and so it's the ideas that we bring are then more rehearsal room ideas as opposed to formative ideas. But at OSF, we used to do text work as the very first thing before the design process even happened, and that was one of the ways that I felt like, as a dramaturg, that you were really able to sort of shape the way that the play was being thought about. So one of the things that I used to do then, and I've done some since, but this is more a thing I used to do then, was something called the Folio Project, because for those of you listening who aren't as big as Shakespeare nerds as us, Shakespeare's texts come out in two different versions: the quartos, which are the small paperbacks that you could put in your pocket and take home, and then the folio, which is the great big first complete works of Shakespeare. And the texts in the quartos and the folios are different. And so one of the things that doing text work with the director very early on, before the design process happens, you're able to then sort of dig into that sort of stuff. So I used to make these sort of Uber resources for the directors, for them to be able to help create their text. So this is an example. This one's an Othello. So this is just sort of a sample page here. So there's a glossary. This is then, it's too big to hold on to. This then is the second quarto text. This is the first quarto text, and this is the folio text. And there's differences between all of those. So having it sort of out in this great big old workbook, we can sit down together and say, yes, this works, yes, this doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another one that I made. This was for an As You Like It, and this again at OSF. And we wanted to look at, As You Like It is a folio only play, so it makes it easier. But then every edition of Shakespeare you look at also is different, especially when it comes to punctuation, which matters a lot to an actor. So we were looking at the different published versions, and then this director was also really interested in what had happened institutionally at OSF before. So this workbook this is the Oxford edition here. This is the Arden 2 edition here, because there was no Arden 3 at that point. This is the first folio. And then over on this side, this is the 2002 OSF As You Like It, and this is the 2007 OSF As You Like It. And then over here, you can see that we started making our cuts. So here I have a note that says break this up, and then this is cut, all gone. Or if a dramaturg is brought into the process that early, that's one of the things that you can definitely provide for a director. And the work that we had already started doing on the 2020 season, Isabel and I, that was a lot of what we were doing over the winter to start getting ready for this season.
Yeah, I mean, I love that because it's obviously there's the historical elements of dramaturgy of providing, or the research-based, portion of the work. And then there's the script development part of this, which is also a key ingredient to, I think, the job, which version do you use? You mentioned the folio and the quarto, and, there's quarto 1, there's quarto 2 in some instances, and the folio, I mean, I think of a play like Hamlet, which Isabel and I worked on last year, there's the folio, there's the bad, what we term as the bad quarto.
Which has some good stuff.
It does, yes. And that's exactly right. And then the second quarto, which is more predominantly used in production, but looking at all of those is beneficial for the director and the play. But you provide a lot of script detail. I mean, describe that for you. I mean, like how, there's also all these different published versions that are out there that are, the Arden or the Cambridge and Pelican, or Penguin, whatever these different publishing houses are that have taken that and put it in. They vary. They vary in punctuation, in breakdown. Can you describe that a little bit about the process? I'm sure every process is a little bit different as far as each director that you work with, but what are your thoughts there as far as the idea of actually, well, this is the version of the script we're going to use for any given production?
Yeah, I think any script that's used is probably a conflation of all of those things you just said, especially if the dramaturg is involved in creating the script, because I know that I always look at all of those things because it's all relevant, it's all important, and there's kind of a tendency in some Shakespeare scholarship to kind of treat the folio as some kind of like a definitive text, and it's really not. It was published after Shakespeare was dead, and we are missing a lot of things from it. So there's actually a lot of good stuff in the quartos that got published as well. And then the editors of the current editions. So I do tend to favor the Arden and the Oxford, but those editions both have these kind of weird quirks. Like the Oxford loves M dashes, and the M dash is actually not easy to act with. So I won't include those in a rehearsal draft that I'm making with the director. The Arden, I find really loves periods. And a period is a full stop, it's a breath, it's the end of a thought. And I think the Arden uses those a little bit too liberally. And there are fewer periods in the folio. So in this world of punctuation, it's kind of looking at all of this and also kind of understanding the Shakespearean actor and what's going to help them the best.
And I would also say that we end up thinking about punctuation a lot in terms of helping the actor, and that it depends on the space. One of the things I've learned is that if you're in a black box, you need more punctuation than if you're in an outdoor theater, because in the outdoor theater, the thoughts have to go all the way out to the outer balcony. And so you need longer thoughts. So you need sentences with less punctuation. And the folio provides that because they were working in a theater that they needed the thoughts to get out to the audience at the Globe. So it's more lightly punctuated than a modern edition, which is really being edited for a reader and not for a speaker. And so they have a lot more logical sentence punctuation than actor-friendly punctuation. We could nerd out about punctuation.
I know. Well, I was going to mention this whole seminar for me is the Shakespeare nerd, and I love it, because I really just love this work. And I actually think a lot of Shakespeare practitioners do also. They love dissecting this. Every production is different. Every actor's interpretation is different, and that's what makes them interesting and also relevant as we continue to do them. We had Renee Thornton Jr. on last week, and one of the things he talked about was, you know, the actor's toolbox in many ways, and the things that each actor uses different forms of how to get to any given moment.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, dramaturgy is the same way, you know, being able to say, well, in this line, there's a comma here, or here there's a period or a semicolon at the end of this line, and there's a choice there we can make as a director or as an actor, to either use that as a breath or an end stop to the point of view, and here's the next point of view on top of that. I don't think people realize the in-depth sort of work that goes on with this text a lot of the time, and there is great discussion and great dialogue. One of our questions that came up, and which we'll get into in a second, was is from Dave, who said, so is it solid flesh or sullied flesh? And that's, I think, a great example of what that is. Like, I mean, I know the answer for that, or what I would answer with that.
Do you?
No, I would say it's up to the actor's discretion, and for them to say, is it solid or is it sullied? And
but how would you approach that? How would you approach that if you were asked that question?
Well, I mean, in the Hamlet room last year, I mean, Brian and I worked on this massive script that ended up being too long on the first day of rehearsal, but there were a lot of words that we had footnoted or sentences that we had footnoted, and there were options at the bottom, and we allowed Quinn to just pick his favorite word.
Yeah.
Because it's his Hamlet. So if he wants to say solid or sullied, both are correct, whatever that means in Shakespeare. And they mean slightly different things, but whatever kind of helps him do the speech.
And I would also say that that's where thinking about director's vision is very useful to me, because there's lots of those tiny little word things, like solid, sullied is a very famous one. My favorite one is Othello, and it is Desdemona. And she says that after Othello told her the story, she gave him 1,000 kisses for the story, or she gave him 1,000 sighs for a story. Those are two different Desdemonas.
Yeah.
A girl who gives somebody 1,000 kisses is a different girl than a girl that gives them 1,000 sighs, right? Like so that's a part of who do we want this woman to be? Which textual choice do we make?
Cool.
It's terrific. Michael, did you have a question? I thought.
I was going to do a housekeeping. So we are starting to get some really great questions that are coming up. We're going to get to most of those in about 10 minutes. So if you have any other questions on Facebook, you can continue to put those there. I want to ask, this is my question, being the nerd that I am. You have to be really flexible because every theater and process you go into is different. So the role that you play as dramaturg is sometimes dictated by the other people within the room. But if you could choose exactly what your process and role of a dramaturg could be, in other words, this is how a perfect dramaturgical process should happen. Is that fair to ask that question? Can I ask that? Because that's not the real world. You're never going to get that. You're always going to go in and say, but I think answering that question kind of unpacks the delicate nature of what you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could, do you always want to come in at the beginning and be part of the formative process?
Yes.
It makes your job easier, right?
Yeah, so, because then you're not coming in blind, right? That you know what. So a lot of being a dramaturg is reading people and reading a room, and I think a lot of being a dramaturg is knowing when to say something, and not just knowing what to say. Well, knowing what to say. I mean, it's not just having knowledge, right? You need to know that this actor is not in a place right now to hear this. Sometimes I feel like some of the best dramaturgy I have done is at the bar after rehearsal, because that's when somebody is able to we just process, so an ideal process. I think I would say my ideal.
What I was looking for. That's what I wanted to find.
Yeah, my ideal process is when the dramaturg is embraced as a collaborator.
Yes.
Whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. So if a theater company who, for whatever reason, has not used dramaturgs and they say, we want to do this. We want to do this. Again, it's number one, you got to hire them and then bring them in at the process and start to educate, because those of us that are old enough to remember this, dramaturgy has always been in the room, but it's been in the last 20 years that it has grown more. Would you agree with that statement? And tell us a little bit about, for people who have not heard of this, how that growth has happened. And some theaters use them more than others.
Mm-hmm.
So how has the role of the dramaturg changed over the past 20 years?
Well, I feel the need to historicize, but that may just be the dramaturg in me. Just to say that this isn't a new job. So when Edmund Kean was doing his historical productions of Shakespeare in the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s, he had an antiquarian on his staff, which is a dramaturg. When Augustin Daly was doing his shows in New York in the 1870s, he had a dramaturg on staff helping him do the text work. So I mean, I would say that it's not new. It's just it's been institutionalized in the United States in the last, I mean, really since Mark Bly. Do you think that's fair, Isabel?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I went to I was lucky enough to I went to a dramaturgy program as my undergrad, and I was only in the 4th graduating class. So
there were no dramaturgy programs when I wanted to do it.
Exactly.
That's great. That's great. And that's exactly what I was looking for. So what other very cool things do dramaturgs do? We were talking before we started about a number of different projects. So we know their script creation and all that type of stuff. What other tasks are dramaturgs laden with within the process?
Well, here, let me share. I actually have created a menu because there are actually so many things a dramaturg could offer that I started needing to have a way to show directors all the things I could do. However, the problem with the menu is you show this to director and a director's like, yes. I want all of that, and then you're like, oh, I now just have made a lot of work for myself. So over here we have a number of pre-production things, and this is for all kinds of plays that aren't new plays. Obviously, with a new play, it's a whole different kind of process. But so things like if you're working on translation. So for instance, I did a 6 characters in search of an author a few years ago, and I read 7 different versions of 6 characters in search of an author, and I gave the director 2 recommendations of the 2 I thought that she should read. So she didn't have to read 6 of them. So that, like a review of adaptations and translations, text history, production history, glossaries are very useful for Shakespeare. Actor packets are something we often do. So information for the actor, bibliography, script analysis are often things I do, a stylistic analysis. And then there's a lot of audience outreach that a dramaturg does. So like Isabel's work on the seminars is definitely in the realm of dramaturgy, but we often write things for playbills, we do lobby displays. We do a lot of work with other departments, which is why an institutional dramaturg is really useful, because that you can help the marketing department show specific stuff. You can help the education department, et cetera, et cetera. And can I scroll down on this? Oh, there's more down there, but here, there we go, figured it out. And then there's a lot of in-rehearsal work that we do as well. I know dramaturgs that do blogs of rehearsal processes so that they can keep track. A useful thing always is to write down what the director wants at the beginning, because sometimes by the end they've lost it in the minutia of everything that's going on. Sometimes during tech, it's very useful for a director for you to come back and say, actually, this is exactly what you wanted at the beginning. While they're tearing their hair out. So that's sort of a snapshot of some of the things that we can and do on any given production.
Fantastic. Dave asks, have you ever been brought into a process too late and noticed flaws in design or other choices or something like that? And then what do you do to resolve that?
I think if you have experience as a dramaturg, that there is kind of such thing as too late, but you can kind of always make it work. Mm-hmm. I mean, especially in a Shakespeare production, if you haven't gotten your hands on the script itself, that can be a challenge. But it's not, but nothing's unworkable, I don't think. I think my example of the director maybe not listening to me in my dramaturgy is a production of Romeo and Juliet that I worked on, not at USF. I love J.R. Sullivan. That was a great production. This is a different production of Romeo and Juliet in which it was hyper-modernized, which I suggested maybe doesn't work with the plot of Romeo and Juliet. And then he put cell phones in the play. And for those of you who know Romeo and Juliet, the play, the dramatic action hinges on a letter not being delivered because there's plague in the city. So if you can text each other, the play doesn't exist. So I kind of gently brought that up. And so the director's solution was he staged a scene in which Romeo left his cell phone in Juliet's bed before he was exiled, which is like, you know, he was listening, but, and then Balthazar shows up, you know, and so why doesn't Romeo just use his phone? You know, so like, that's the kind of thing where it's like, well, you know, but at a certain point, if that's what the director really wants, then you're just there to kind of mitigate.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, like, it is sort of, as we re-evaluate these plays and conceptually put them into under new lenses and all this stuff, there are things that you have to think about, you have to consider, you know, just that very idea, correspondence at the time, people getting missives, a letter, it's coming in a completely different form than how we're getting it now. And as the director and the drama, you have to solve that stuff. You have to find those answers to make that work. I've often found that a lot of times it's like you have to think of the ABCs of every little bit, everything has to line up as you're putting the show together. And if there are questions that you ask somewhere else early on, more often than not, it's going to come back and haunt you somewhere else later. And I've always felt dramaturg is really instrumental in that way of kind of going, no, here's another eye on the play going, this happened over here that might not have linked up over here. And you need to find something to sort of bring that back. Otherwise, it's just like throwing a bomb out there that is going to explode and we're not going to be aware of it. You know, I love that. One of the questions that is here right now, in many ways, was kind of that same idea. Michelle asks, how does the dramaturg help an actor director highlight areas of the text to pull out a specific decision about the character? Lezlie, you kind of touched on that a little bit with Desdemona and the example of the 1,000 kisses or sighs. But are there examples where you could say that, where you could say, oh, this particular actor is playing this role now under this lens, this is going to resonate more now with this than it might be elsewhere? Can you think of any examples where that might have been the case?
Well, here's one that when we were working on Comedy of Errors this last spring, there's an interesting thing with the Dromios where they are technically the slaves of the Antipholi. And do you use the word slave? Because for an American audience in 2020, that has a very different connotation than it did for Shakespeare's audience in 1596. You know, that it's it hits our ear differently. Is that a word we want to use, and in which case we are going to be using it, or is that a word we want to change? And again, that also depends a little bit on casting. So another word that's like that has just completely changed in meaning is the word niggardly, which does not mean what it sounds like it means to us. And do we still use that word on stage? Whose mouth is it coming out of? What meaning does that have? So there's little choices like that that I could definitely point to as places that we would do that kind of work. And I would also say just sort of being able to tap into actors' processes and what might help them in a moment. So like little bits of research, like Isabel and I were talking about how often helping an actor realize how far they've traveled can help them make a choice. Like, you've been walking for 10 days and they're like, oh, I'm really tired, right? So that those sorts of things are sort of the kind of things I could point to. Isabel, do you have better examples?
No, those are probably the kind of the ones that I would give. Yeah, I mean, I can show an example of a map that I made for Pericles really fast. So it's sort of this kind of thing, which can be very helpful, just to kind of see just how far things are from each other, and how long, like for instance in Pericles, you would have been at sea for, which is, you know, like a week is much different than a day.
Yeah.
I mean, I love this notion of, comes up a lot, is like, are these plays presented in their entire authentic form? And I was like, no, they never are. They're always cut, they're always adapted, they're always changed. People move scenes around, they change words because they don't have the same prominence now, or we're going to use this word versus this word because it's clearer for a modern audience to understand what that word means. And more often than not, it's built in with the rhythm and all of that, and that's being...
Shakespeare did that too, we know.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's something to think of. I mean, and also to keep in mind, I mean, they were written for a contemporary audience at the time, where they were really inside that, and now we're presenting them in a different form.
The same thing happened. I mean, the script of Macbeth that we currently have is an adaptation of Macbeth by Thomas Middleton for the King's Men, after Shakespeare was no longer a member of the company, with the Hecate scene in there. So we don't actually have Shakespeare's Macbeth. I would be so bold as to say. What we have is an adaptation, and I would say that's probably true of many of the scripts, in ways that we don't know as people who just have the printed scripts and not the theatrical scripts.
I want to bridge this. There's a question from Tracy that says, how do you feel about the lexicons as a resource for actors? So I want you, I want you to expand that. If an actor or a director wants a number of resources, what would you recommend as their resources so that they can be better prepared as actors? Are lexicons a good resource?
Yes.
Yes.
The lexicons are good. You can get them online for those of you who like to travel light, through perseus.tufts.edu. And I also like Shakespeare's Words by David Crystal is a good one. Yay! Mine's right up there.
Mine's right over there.
Yeah, and it's good to tell them what they are. I mean, like.
Oh yeah. So the lexicons are older, so they were done in the 19th century, so there is some prudery to the lexicons. If we're talking about any sexual puns, the lexicon is going to be very delicate about that. But they're essentially a Shakespeare dictionary, and they're incredibly useful that way. One of my favorite resources, which I think is still locked in the rehearsal room from when my show stopped in March, is the Shakespeare Thesaurus. Because a lot of my head's a little bit the Shakespeare Thesaurus. When you're looking for a word to replace, like we want to replace the word slave, I'll throw it out there because that's the one that's already out there. What word can we use? Can we just go to knave? Can we go to sirrah? Can we go to, right? So, but the Shakespeare Thesaurus gives you a host of other options, because often when we're doing that kind of work, we're also trying to find something that fits in the verse. So that's also something that we...
What about online resources? Open source Shakespeare, other sources like that. What do you enjoy online?
Folger digital texts are very important. MIT's Shakespeare, you can get all the folios there.
Yeah.
Internet Shakespeare editions, you can look at folio and quarto.
I like the Internet Shakespeare editions.
Yeah, facsimiles. So if you don't want to carry around your giant book, or you aren't somebody who paid too much money for a quarto, then those are all available in Internet Shakespeare editions.
Cool.
Am I forgetting any?
No, but those are the ones I use.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I think
This is
that's
good.
great. Cool. What a beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you're right. They also sometimes have different meaning in different contexts. The lexicons are really great that way because they show you every play that word is used in and what context it's used in. And so that also helps you frame that. You can look up a word like love which, you know, you would think everybody knows what that is and just go through it. And there's a lot. there could be many different variations of what that is.
Go ahead. Do you want to take
Can I jump in with an interesting note on that particular word?
Yeah.
So I did a production of Julius Caesar a few years ago, and one of the things I like to do, if I have the time with the cast, is to do big charts of the play so we can see the whole thing. So this is the chart that we did for Julius Caesar. So we charted everybody's action through the play. Everybody's so you can see, I can't actually point it in the middle there, it says stab, because there's a big stabby scene. So everybody's action was stabbing. And then we started charting the major words that were used through the play. So you might see that there's blood, 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 blood. But what we discovered in this play is that about after intermission, so there's a lot of stabbing and blood that happens right before intermission. And after intermission, the word that is used the most often is love.
Wow.
And what we discovered through that process is Julius Caesar is a play about love.
Wow.
Which was not what we were expecting. We were expecting a play about stabbing and blood. And what we discovered is that it's a play about love, and that's what was motivating people. And that was, and so that changed everything about how we were thinking about the relationships. That those were all love relationships, even with Caesar, who you're stabbing, which changes your stabbing. So I think love is one of the underutilized words to look at in the Shakespeare canon.
Yeah. That's some good dramaturgy, Lezlie.
Thanks.
It's amazing.
I'm proud of that one. It was a very pretty chart.
No, but that is, I mean, like that, I love that about those plays too. You know, they're word like mad, you know, in a play like Hamlet, how many times that word is used over the course of the play. When you really count them, it's really amazing when you see what Shakespeare was doing that might have been subconsciously hitting an audience that they just go, oh, this play is about that. Or even like looking at the end word of every phrase, the last word through the course of a speech will sometimes tell you what that whole speech is about, you know, question, or as you keep going through, they really sometimes will help identify what's happening psychologically for the character. Another question that has come up, which I think is great actually, Jarrell, why are the problem plays considered problems? Measure for Measure makes sense, but what am I missing, he's saying.
So I worked on a production of Timon of Athens at OSF, which is notoriously problematic. When we at OSF, we do a thing called show introductions. So like Isabel does these incredible first day of rehearsal speeches, which unfortunately the public don't get to see, but show introductions were for the public. And in my my sort of public remarks on Timon, I said it's problematic on purpose because we're watching a man in a society fall apart. And that's why the language is tangled up in knots. And that part of what Shakespeare and Middleton were doing in that play was showing decay. And if as soon as I started breaking it down, like I did a big chart for myself, the play is incredibly symmetrical. Structurally, it's beautiful. But linguistically, it's a big old mess. You know, I mean, structurally, the first act ends with the dinner, the second act ends with the dinner. He has a big rant midway through, he has a big rant midway, like it's beautifully structured, but it feels like a big old mess because I think that the language of the play is echoing the character's internal struggle. So I would say that there's some problem plays that we find problematic because we want Aristotelian structure, and Shakespeare did not care about Aristotle because he didn't know he existed. So I would say that's also part of it.
There's also, you know, the traditional problem play is one, like a lot of the examples are technically comedies, but we don't find them funny. So someone just slapped the word problem on them. But the plays actually work beautifully. Like Measure for Measure is a great example. It's so relevant now. it is funny, but it's really dark. It's also kind of an upsetting play, and everyone doesn't die, so it's technically a comedy, but more contemporary audiences have a harder time with that because it's not like a Much Ado About Nothing, which is consistently pretty funny, even though that has problems too, right? Like the whole hero plot line. And so I think a lot of what a problem play is are plays that are a little bit discordant with modern audiences. So like The Merchant of Venice is a great example of this, because Shakespeare never met a Jew, probably. And so that entire play is based around the two things that Shakespeare knew about Jews, that they were, supposedly greedy, and that they didn't eat pork. And so most of the humor in that play comes from that, and the fact that in Shakespeare's England, a Jew was a target of comedic action. And now that's doesn't really fly as well with modern audiences. So when you work on a play like that, as a dramaturg in particular, there's a lot of pressure because you're trying to do the play justice, but we, as a responsible theater makers, shouldn't do The Merchant of Venice the way it was intended, because it would make us all extremely anti-Semitic. So there's kind of a way that Merchant is done now, in which Shylock is kind of this tragic figure that's actually, as much as we can say Shakespeare's intention, it's not in the play. It's not actually there. It's a comedy, and we're supposed to feel vindicated and happy as Shylock is forced into Christianity, which actually would have led to his death.
Well, and I'd also say that Shakespeare didn't call them comedies. It's when the printer put together the first folio, he was like, we need an organizing principle. Let's call these ones comedies, these ones tragedies, and these ones histories. And it stuck. And a bunch of things got stuck in the comedy area that I don't think should be there. And, and also I would say that the word comedy and the word comedian used to mean something different. So a comedian was just a player. It didn't necessarily mean that it was hilarious. There's also some ways that the genre has changed in the past 400 plus years.
Shakespeare wasn't writing in genre, and he wasn't concerned with genre in any way. Otherwise, he wouldn't have written Pericles.
I think he was concerned with breaking what were generic boundaries.
Yeah, definitely.
Things like the Porter. Like how do we break generic boundaries in these ways? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the idea too of it just that it happening live and from an audience that's probably in the middle of the day. In theory, everything was happening. Audience was right there at their feet. There were probably more impromptu moments that were happening in any of these plays that might not have been translated to text later as a line. Or maybe that was an impromptu thing that then got generated into what we now know as like a hugely comic moment in some of these plays. And I'm really glad you said the thing about like he wasn't writing for a specific genre, because even a lot of the comedies are dark, they're bleak. Dire life and death things happen in those plays. They just don't end up in a death near the end of the play. I mean, a lot of times that's kind of how people categorize them. A tragedy is that people die in the end, and then the comedy, well, nobody dies. But along the way, you at the end of Measure for Measure is like, is Isabel really want to marry the Duke? I don't know. Kate and Petruchio at the end of that play, Kate's final monologue. What is that? How does that resonate now? Merchant is another one. What happens to Shylock at the end of that play? I don't really see that as comic at all. And there are things in there it's hard to categorize them as that. You have to look at them as just like, this is a play. Even the history plays, which are like, they're history plays, but inside that and there are, like, I think of Romeo and Juliet, which I think is absolutely hysterical in the first.
Oh, it's hilarious.
It's one of the funniest.
Yeah, until Mercutio dies.
Yeah, Hamlet too is very funny. Yes,
the wit and the irony and the ambiguity that he was continually playing with in all these plays is really, really profound.
I think that there's something in terms of providing dramaturgical context about the fact that death was much more a part of their lives. The way that the plague came every few years. In order to get to the theater, you walked along a bridge with heads on spikes along the sides. Like death was much more a part of their life. So I think that the way that we think of death as very tragic was potentially not the way they thought about it. Like death could be a number of different things. I think that Joan's death in the Henrys, that's not necessarily a tragic death in some ways. So they had a different relationship with mortality than we do.
Oh yeah, and like Henry IV, part 1, or part 2, it's like here we have this deep history play, but in the middle of that is like the greatest comic character ever penned with Falstaff, and like who's just like defying authority and doing all this stuff and jokes left and right, and it's immensely funny. And you're right that their world was surrounded by the immediacy of mortality, of what might be next.
This is a big question. How do you feel about the theories that, quote, Shakespeare didn't write all the plays that are attributed to him? So define for us, quote, who wrote Shakespeare?
Well, I did my master's degree in Stratford upon Avon, so I have feelings. Yeah, does it change the plays for us? Because honestly, I would say that the Hamlet that y'all saw was written by Brian and Isabel and Quinn, and Andrew and Jackie and everybody else that was in that, right? So it's yeah.
So your leanings, Lezlie, are to The Man from Stratford as a collaborator.
Yes, well, because I also think that those plays were written by the King's Men. Yep. Which is why initially when they came out, this was the Chamberlain's Men, I suppose, first. This was a play by the Chamberlain's Men. And having worked on new plays in a room with actors, the actors 100% help write the plays. So I think that that they were plays written by theater companies that had somebody who was leading the charge. I did just watch a movie about Edward de Vere. And I have some very fresh feelings about that.
He's such anonymous.
No, it was a different one. Yeah, we had some feelings. There was some yelling. But I mean, like, there's some interesting thoughts about that. I mean, the fact that so many of the plays aren't set in England, and as far as we know, The Man from Stratford never left the country, but also The Man from Stratford thinks Bohemia has a seacoast. So
yeah. I always point towards the authorship question. No one really was concerned with it until the height of the British Empire. So I think it's kind of a result of imperialism, because
it was Americans that did it.
It was Americans that did it. But it was a concerned class system, because if the greatest English poet that ever lived was a commoner who didn't have a formal education, well, that looks bad for a lot of people. So that's when other people who are all nobles are kind of brought forward as potential alternates for Shakespeare. But I do agree with Lezlie. I think ultimately it was a big collaboration. But I think Shakespeare, he was, like, there's a lot of evidence he was a real person.
No, go ahead.
I would also say that given the evidence we have from other playwrights at the time, they were all writing plays together.
Yes.
Beaumont and Fletcher, Decker and Ford, Marlowe. Like that it was a collaborative playwriting environment that was probably much more like a TV writer's room than the image of Shakespeare with his quill pen in his attic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We are coming up on 11 o'clock. This could go on a full hour longer, but I think, Brian, we can clear these questions out. So we're going to go about 5 minutes over, if that's okay. Are we okay with that?
Okay. Sure, yeah.
Of course.
In the control room, we're going
Speed round.
We're going to drive. Ready? What do you think of, quote, original pronunciation? You just quoted Crystal. What do you think of that?
It's very cool.
It's interesting. Yeah, I saw an original pronunciation, Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, it helps with the rhyme, and you feel the rhythm of the language a little bit more. I think that it's not. I think it's an exercise as opposed to a way to produce Shakespeare. Is my feeling.
Cool.
I agree.
But it's interesting. It's super interesting.
We have kind of touched on this. Ivy, thank you for this question. How do you work with actors to make the characters their own? Are there ways that characters are, quote, meant to be portrayed?
No.
No.
Definitely not. Yeah. I think any character in Shakespeare can be played by any human. And I'm sure that.
And sometimes a dog.
And yeah, and sometimes like.
Or in space.
Or in space, and sometimes a fusion of a person and a computer, as is like some of the RSC stuff. So the characters are infinitely flexible.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I think more often than not that people want to do stuff against what we term as meant, you know what I mean? No, let's take another view at this. And everyone's own identity inside of them too alters them immediately, you know, whether it's a different actor, but also like cross-gendering roles and all of that, which we haven't even delved into, but is another fragment of that same idea where it's like, who defines what is meant to be also about what they are. It's just how we've sort of seen them over history. And now I think we're at a great transition period where it's like, no, we're going to present these plays in completely different ways for people to begin looking at them. There's no right or wrong about this work, you know.
I'd also say the question behind that is, how do we help an actor? Which I would say that by providing the resources that that actor needs. And some actors love having research. I've done whole packets for one actor.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some actors who don't rely on us that much, that take the script, ignore our punctuation, and move on with their lives, you know. So I think that honoring an actor's process and where they're coming from in the script and being able to see where that is part of what our job is.
Yeah, a huge part of our job, which Lezlie already said, I just want to like reiterate it, is listening and reading other people and timing.
Cool. 2 questions. One that we could focus an hour on. Do you have any thoughts about translating Shakespeare? And I'm assuming that, yeah, go ahead.
I've worked on that project. I have been a dramaturg on 3 or maybe 4 of those translation.
I've done 4.
Have I done 4?
Yeah.
I've done 4. One of which with David Ivers, our dear friend. I think that it can open up a lot of possibilities. I think that it is a fantastic exercise for a playwright to learn how to use their voice. One of the things I love so much that's come out of the Play On project are the response plays. We did Shrew at USF, which was Amy Fried's response to having to translate Taming of the Shrew, and she got very angry at Taming of the Shrew as she was translating Taming of the Shrew, and so she did a response play. And Marcus Gardley's going to do a Lear response play. I mean, and Taylor Mack's Gary was a response to him working on Titus Andronicus. So I think that there's a lot to be gained from playwrights engaging with the text as deeply as you have to in order to translate it. I also think it's a great exercise for classrooms.
Yes.
Great exercise for classrooms. I've never had students respond to Shakespeare as positively as when I made them do translation exercises.
Yes.
Good. And then the last one, is it challenging to switch gears from one version of a play to another? I'm assuming
the same play?
Yes, I think, yeah. So
there's usually so much time in between, usually.
Oh, but I mean, one of the things I do is study adaptation, so I actually do a lot of that.
Yeah.
No.
Cool.
No. I think I can hold multiple versions of Shakespeare in my head at the same time. So.
Cool.
Yeah, so I would say no.
We would be remiss not to have that beautiful fact that you gave us, Isabel, before we even started. Tell us about Pericles.
Oh, sure. Pericles was the play in the early 1600s that reopened the theaters after the plague. So it's, and you can see it very much in it. It's a play about hope.
Cool, cool. I am so grateful that you joined us today. I want to do a shout out again to Cedar City and Bryan Head Tourism Bureau. We're so grateful for the sponsorship of great things like this, where we find out more about the process and the plays, etc. I'm grateful to the legacy that Michael Finlayson and then Michael Flockman, Camp Shakespeare, again, another shout out there. Join us next year for Camp Shakespeare. We're going to be up here and we'd love to have you come and join us for that. It's great to have you here joining us as well. And I'm grateful for the work of dramaturgs. Thank you so much. Brian?
Yeah, here. I just thank you both for being here very much. You know, we could talk for a whole other hour because I know that we've touched on a fragment of the stuff that you work on. You know, we didn't even dive into new plays and new play development and playwriting, which I do think all of these things are interconnected in many ways, and how you look at a new play that is being crafted potentially in the room with a bunch of different people and how that formulates what's written. That's a whole other dialogue in itself, on top of working at these, diving into some of this classical text and the Shakespeare-driven material. But I thank you for taking the time. It just reinforces my idea of how fond I am of both of you and your intellect inside these plays. And we're really lucky to have you. Thanks for your insight and for your stewardship of this work, which I do think is really vital going forward. You know, of putting these plays out there, keeping people to dive into text, to dramaturgy, to drama, to literature, to writing, to new plays, and the beautiful thing of theater, you know, which I do think is a mirror to our own existence, which is beautiful. So thank you.
We miss it.
I know.
We miss it. I miss USF.
I know.
We miss it. And Lezlie, you need to say what you said before we started too. What has this time proven to you?
Yeah, I said before in our sort of preamble that one of the things that the past few months has really proven to me is that we need live theater, because there's definitely a hunger for it out there right now, and that I'm definitely feeling the lack of being in a room with other people, breathing together, laughing together, getting upset together. We need it back. Yeah.
Bless you. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you next week. Actually, tomorrow, we've got a great panel at 1 o'clock. Join us for our production seminar, where we're going to meet the magic makers who make this magic happen. And then next week, next Thursday, we're going to be talking about we're going to be seeking the relevance in shrew. So we'll look forward to seeing that next Thursday. So yeah, look at those eyebrows go up. So thank you. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you all online. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.